I will be
Thank you
here
so
if you need something.
Should I just start now then?
Yeah.
I guess. And do I mean I also just want to be sure that that the sound comes through. I mean, can everybody hear what I'm saying?
Yes, we
Yeah.
hear
Okay.
perfectly.
Well,
I think Sophie says maybe you're too loud.
I'm too loud. Okay.
Yeah. It wasn't me, it was your wife.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody. As Celia just mentioned, I mean, I was in Buenos Aires until very recently. Unfortunately, family matters require that I return to Copenhagen. I'm very sorry that I'm missing this whole workshop, that I can't be present in person. I would have loved to listen to the other talks, and I would also have loved to engage, personally with all of you. But I hope that what I'm going to present and what follows will make some sense, and that it will be an opportunity for me to share some ideas with you. And I'm very much looking forward to what is hopefully going to be an interesting discussion afterwards. So basically, just to get started, let me start with two quotes, one from Donald Davidson and the other from Habermas. So Davidson writes, objectivity itself we have traced to the intersections of points of view. And Habermas wrote, ohne Intersubjektivität des Verstehens keine Objektivität des Wissens. Now, I think a lot has happened in philosophy of mind and the cognitive sciences as regards the study of consciousness during the last 30 to 35 years. I mean, before then, the situation was often as described by the neuroscientist Damasio in his book, The Feeling of What Happens. As he wrote back then, studying consciousness was simply not the thing to do before you made tenure. And even after you did, it was looked upon with suspicion. Now, this is no longer the case, but even if it has been a step forward, that people are now again studying consciousness and even paying attention to what they call the phenomenology of subjective experience, I also think it's important to do that in the right way. Now, what is the wrong way is to view subjective experiences as private objects visible only to the owner, and to identify phenomenology with the study of the what-its likeness of mental states. Subjective experiences are not just simply occurrent objects in a pre-given world. Rather, they are precisely what in the first place allows us to epistemically encounter a world. And experiences are not just private, they are also visible to and shareable with others. As for phenomenology, the term has been co-opted by many analytic philosophers of mind and cognitive scientists as a label for the study of the qualitative character of phenomenal consciousness. But this use of the term falls short in so many ways of what the phenomenological tradition has to say about the character and significance of consciousness. Now, what I want to do and what follows is to argue that if we are to understand subjective experiences, if we are to get them right, we can't examine them in isolation. We need to understand the relationship between the subjective, the intersubjective, and the objective. And more specifically, I would like to put forward the thesis that objectivity involves not just a reference to both subjectivity and intersubjectivity, but also requires both to be thought of in very specific ways. I think ideas to that effect can be found in classical phenomenology, and so by engaging with that classical discussion, I also hope to make it clear to everybody, in case there should be any doubters in this specific audience, that there is, of course, much more to a phenomenological investigation of consciousness than simply a careful description of phenomenal states. So let me start with objectivity. Perhaps the most straightforward way to criticize the idea that subjective experiences are simply objects is by pointing to their intentional character. I mean, subjective experiences are themselves object-directed, are precisely what allows us to be aware of and presented with objects in the first place. One trope in classical German philosophy has been the idea that an object, a Gegenstand, is precisely given as a Gegenstand, that is, as something that stands opposed to or in contrast to the intentional experience. Another trope is that our experience of objects, qua objects, is an experience of something that transcends or surpasses our own experiential perspective. And I think in both cases, I mean, the central idea is that the very sense of objects is something that involves a demarcating reference to something they are not, namely subjective experiences. Now, what I will do in the following is not to engage more specifically with the topic of intentionality, but I want to start out by taking a closer look at an idea that has resemblances to the classical tropes that I have just mentioned. And this is an idea that we find presented in Husserl. In formal and transcendental logic, Husserl argued that a clarification of objectivity in the sense of that which is in principle valid for everybody requires a closer analysis of intersubjectivity. Now, Husserl is not denying that I on my own can have an experience of object identity and object persistency. I mean, one and the same object can be given to me in different intentional experiences, and insofar as the object retains its identity across numerically distinct experiences, it will also be given as having a certain transcendence or independence vis-a-vis those experiences. But for Husserl, this will remain a very limited, he even calls it a solipsistic form of objectivity. Because as much as the object will then be given to me as surpassing my concrete experiences, its unity and identity will still be bound to my perspective. It will be an identity and a unity across my actual and possible experiences. The moment other subjects, however, enter the stage, and the moment it becomes clear to me that the object I am experiencing is also experienced by other subjects, the object will acquire a different status and validity. And I mean, in Husserl's texts, he also tries to exemplify this by considering a contrast case. I mean, even if I, on my own, might enjoy various perceptions of one and the same tomato and come to have an experience of the tomato as objective, it would be very difficult for me to continue to experience the tomato in that way if I suddenly realized that nobody else could see it. This is, however, I mean, this discussion of how the inclusion of others can change the validity of the objects that I'm experiencing is only the first start of the investigation, because Husserl ultimately moves on to distinguish a number of different levels of objectivity. There is the objectivity of that which is valid for a limited intersubjectivity, the us of an in-group, and there is the objectivity of that which is valid for an unlimited totality of rational subjects. And just as the concrete encounter between two individuals can occasion a change in perspective, a change in validity, the encounter between two communities can also lead to a change in perspective. We might come to the realization that what we took to be objectively valid is in fact merely valid for the members of our own group and that what we took to be the world as such is indeed merely our own homeworld. So what we also find in Husserl is a discussion of how the encounter between different communal perspectives, the encounter between different forms of group-based normality can lead us towards a more demanding notion of objectivity, the notion namely of that which is valid not just for a limited group of people, but that which is valid universally. So, as I've just been trying to illustrate, for Husserl, the very sense of objectivity and objective validity entails a reference to the encounter of an intersection between points of view. My experiential and my experimental findings must be shareable, must be replicable if they are to qualify as objectively valid. And Husserl is not the only one to argue in this fashion. I mean, I already started out by providing you with some quotes from Davidson and Habermas, and both of them are entertaining similar ideas. But there is, of course, a difference between arguing that there is a connection between objectivity and the meeting of minds, and that is, I think, an idea shared by Habermas, Davidson, and Husserl. Something else is to spell out exactly how we are to understand subjectivity and intersubjectivity if such an account of objectivity is to be intelligible and possible. And that is what I want to try to do in the remainder of my talk. So let me move on to the issue of subjectivity. I mean, what account of subjectivity is required if the notion of objectivity that I just introduced you to is to be possible? Now, in his account, Husserl often refers to the notion of a subjective perspective. I mean, the object is precisely that which transcends the subjective perspective. But how should we understand that notion? Now, in a recent article from 2009, Olaf Blanke and Thomas Metzinger, neuroscientist and an analytic philosopher, they offered a definition of what they called a weak first-person perspective. And so on their account, a weak first-person perspective is a purely geometrical feature of our visuospatial presentation of reality. When we perceive objects, we see objects as being to the right or left, further away or closer by. And one way to understand a first-person perspective is to understand it simply as the 0 point of projection that functions as the geometrical origin of the seeing organism's embodied perspective. So this is the phrasing of Blanke and Metzinger. I think, however, by closer consideration, that it should be fairly clear that such a geometrical definition does not capture the subjectivity of experience. I mean, even a video camera positioned up in the corner of the room or a robot might receive perspectively structured visual input, but there would presumably be no what it's like for them to undergo such perspectival presentations. And so to put it slightly differently, I mean, if we are to understand what is meant by an experiential perspective, I don't think we should attend to geometry. I don't think we can make do with a geometrical definition. No, what we need to do is to engage directly with the topic of phenomenal consciousness. Now, when we do that, when we analyze experiential episodes, we also need to realize, and what we need to realize is that there is more to experiential episodes than merely their qualitative character. That is the fact that there is something it is like to taste coffee, see a sunset, touch an ice cube, enjoy a concert, etc., etc. What we also need to factor in is the fact that an experience is like something for someone, and that conscious experiences involves an experiential perspective or point of view. I mean, all experiences, be they exteroceptive, interoceptive, proprioceptive, emotional, etc., are by virtue of their very nature first personal. So they are not just qualitative, they are also subjective. They are perspectively owned and are not given as free-floating anonymous episodes. I mean, as Sidney Shoemaker once put it, it's essential to a philosophical understanding of the mental that we appreciate that there is a first-person perspective on it, a distinctive way mental states present themselves to the subjects whose states they are. And one way to capture the fact that our experiential life is characterized not just by a qualitative character, but also by a subjective character, is to talk not just of the what it's likeness of experience, but to talk of the what it's like for me-ness of experience, because that slogan captures both the qualitative and the subjective component. However, even after having introduced that locution, one might still wonder, I mean, what exactly is that supposed to mean? I mean, what does it mean to say that experiences are first personal, that they are characterized by perspectival ownership or by for-me-ness? And I think the simple idea is basically the following. The very having or undergoing or living through of the experience entails an acquaintance with that experience which is not available from the outside. So again, one way to phrase that is by saying that if you are observing somebody undergoing experiences such as feeling pain or nausea or tasting hot chocolate or being angry or shameful, if you're observing somebody undergoing these experiences, you will not be presented with those experiences in the same way as the person undergoing them. And what is the implication of that? Well, the implication is that to have an experiential perspective on the world is not just a question of being experientially directed at the world. No, it also involves a certain subjective reflexivity or self-intimation. And I mean, this is a very classical idea that can be found both in Western philosophy, but also in Indian philosophy. I mean, you can find ideas like this, Aristotle, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, more recently in 19th and 20th century philosophy in Brentano, Sartre, Dieter Henrich, Frankfurt, Kriegel, Montague, and many others. And of course, people might use slightly different terminology, but what they all kind of cohere on is the suggestion that if we want to understand phenomenal consciousness, it's not enough just to look at how the experience presents the object. We also need to look at how the experience presents itself. Now, this is not just an idea found in all the people I've just mentioned. This is also an idea we can find in Husserl. But I think what we find in Husserl, I mean, the way he presents it in one specific context at least, he does it in a way with a twist that I think is absent in these other authors, and in a way that already brings in the topic of intersubjectivity. And let me try to illustrate how that happens. If we return to the first edition of Logical Investigations, as most of you will know, Husserl's aim was to offer an analysis of the essential structures of intentionality. And as part of that analysis, he famously and explicitly defended a no ownership view, and he rejected the idea that there is a pure ego. He rejected the idea that experiences are necessarily perspectively owned. Now, by the time of the second edition of Logical Investigations, Husserl had changed his mind. as he also makes clear in a footnote to the second edition. And of course, one intriguing question is, well, why did that happen? Why did he change his view? I think that Marbach points or puts his finger at the explanation. And this is an argument that we find in Marbach's classical monograph, Das Problem des Ich, in der Phenomenologie Husserls. Because what Marbach points out is that one of Husserl's main reasons for making this change was due to the difficulties that Husserl's original theory encountered when it came to the problem of offering a phenomenological analysis of intersubjectivity. Now, a condition of possibility for investigating phenomenologically intersubjectivity is that one operates with a conception of consciousness that allows one to demarcate one consciousness from another, thereby allowing for plurality of consciousnesses. I mean, that is required if we are to talk about intersubjectivity. But it seems to be exactly that demarcation that seems out of reach for a conception of consciousness that is non-ecological, and where the basic kind of model of consciousness is basically a conception of experiences that are anonymous, that doesn't belong to anybody. Here's how Marbach puts it. The analysis of phenomenological experience brings a cardinal difference to the fore. I have conscious experiences which I call my own, and I have conscious experiences of conscious experiences which are not my own, but rather alien. Now, if clarity is to prevail, that is, if we are to operate with this distinction between own experiences and alien experiences, it is no longer possible simply to speak of nobody's experiences. Now, on some accounts, and I mean, I will return to those shortly, it actually makes little sense to claim, as Marbach just did, that I can have experiences that are not my own, but alien. That is, that I can have experiences of other people's experiences. Because the argument could be that the only experiences I have any experiential acquaintance with are my own experiences, and that whatever experiences others might have are never given in any way whatsoever. So strictly speaking, I can't encounter experientially somebody's sadness. I can see drops of liquid rolling from their eyes. I can see contortions of their facial muscles. I can hear broken sounds, but that's what I can see. That's what I'm experientially encountering. And if it seems to me that I perceive more of that, well, then it must be due to some kind of influence of theory and inference, because strictly speaking, none of that is given. Now that view, and as I just mentioned, I will return to that later, is a view that has been criticized, not just by classical phenomenologists, but also by more recent contributions to the social cognition debate. And what people have been arguing is that they have been arguing that it makes sense and that we are justified in talking about something like social perception or person perception. It has been argued that we can see the other's elation or doubt in his face, that we can hear the other's trepidation, impatience, or bewilderment in her voice, that we can feel the other's enthusiasm in his handshake, grasp his mood in his posture, and see her determination and persistence in her actions. But here's the question, and here's the challenge. Were we to assume what could be called a richer account of perception, I mean, would that then not present us with a certain problem? I mean, if I encounter a crying child, and if I have a certain experiential grasp of the crying child's sorrow, well, what is it then that makes me able to distinguish my own experience of, say, empathic concern and the child's experience of sorrow? I mean, what is it that makes me able to make a distinction between my own experiences and the experience that are alien. And here I think is what Marbach and Husserl would argue. They would argue that there is a difference in the givenness of those experiences. So it's not a difference between givenness on the one hand and no givenness on the other. No, it's a difference between types of givenness. My own experience of empathic concern will be given to me first personally, but the child's sorrow will not be given first personal to me. Rather, the first personal givenness of the sorrow of the child is precisely something that eludes my grasp. And what does all of that have to do with Husserl's shift from a non-ecological to an ecological conception of consciousness? Well, here's the argument. Initially, Husserl defended a non-ecological account of consciousness, but that account was, reached the limit the moment Husserl was trying to develop a convincing analysis of intersubjectivity. Now, being faced with the problem of intersubjectivity forced Husserl to become more appreciative of the first personal character of consciousness. And eventually he realized that a proper appreciation of this first personal character should not only make us stop talking of consciousness being characterized by a fundamental anonymity, he also argued that a proper appreciation of this first personal character should make us ascribe a fundamental subjectivity or egocentricity to consciousness. So just to recap, my starting point was that a discussion of how our experience of something as subjective involves not just an experience of something that transcends our own perspective, but also an experience of something that can be shared with other subjects. And I then argue that if that kind of experience is to be possible, it's not only necessary that we have an experiential perspective, we also have to be aware of that experiential perspective. And of course, this way of formulating the idea brings us very close to an old Kantian idea, the idea namely that self-consciousness is a transcendental precondition for objectivity. So I mean, again, just to rephrase, the idea is that we cannot have an experience of objectivity understood as something that transcends our experiential perspective unless we also have an experience of those experiential perspectives, and that's that's a form of self-consciousness. But that, as I've also tried to make clear, that's only the first half of the argument, because in order to have an experience of something being objective, it's not enough that I have an experience of something that transcends my own perspective. I also need to have an experience of something that is accessible to and shareable with others. And in order for me to have an experience of that, I need some kind of experiential grasp of that plurality. But how is that possible? I mean, how do we come to be aware of a plurality of perspectives? How do we come to experience something as valid for us? Now, as I already made clear when I was discussing Husserl's conception of objectivity, I mean, there are different levels to that question. There are different levels of what we mean by valid for us. And I don't have time to kind of go through the whole kind of sequence. So I will make do with just paying attention to what is arguably the most fundamental level, which I think can be discussed under the rubric of joint attention. And so let's move on to the final part of the presentation. Now, what exactly is joint attention? Now, if one goes to the discussion in developmental psychology and cognitive science, I mean, there's broad consensus that joint attention is not just a question of two unrelated people simultaneously looking at the same thing, nor do we have joint attention if the attention of one of them is causally influenced by the eye direction of the other. I mean, that would not be sufficient. If joint attention is to occur, it is required that it is, as some scholars have said, it is required that it is mutually manifest to both. It must involve an awareness of attending together. So joint attention involves recognizing the presence of another experiential perspective on the world. And I mean, as Tomasello, who is one of the figures that have really contributed to this specific discussion, as he at one point put it or phrased it, joint attention begins the process by which human beings construct an intersubjective world with others, shared but with differing perspectives. Now, some have viewed joint attention as a form of communicative interaction. It's something that binds the participants together. It allows for the emergence of a common vantage point, a shared perspective from which we survey the world together. And the moment that is established, we are not merely dealing with facts for me or with facts for you, but with facts that are entre nous, to use the formulation by Taylor. I also think we find the same idea in Husserl, so this is from Ideas 2. We are in a relation to a common surrounding world. We are in a personal association. These belong together. We could not be persons for others if a common surrounding world did not stand there for us in a community, in an intentional linkage of our lives. Correlatively spoken, the one is constituted essentially with the other. So I think what Husserl is highlighting here is basically the idea that the dyadic encounter between two subjects do not occur in a kind of acosmic vacuum. The dyadic encounter between two subjects is precisely something that binds them together in relation to a common surrounding world. It's something that happens in and for a world. And of course, and I mean, this is something that I don't have time to elaborate on in this connection, but I just want to kind of point to it. When talking about how experiential perspectives intersect, I mean, we shouldn't just talk of how that intersection, I mean, how the external object is the kind of the meeting point of the perspectives. Because when encountering other experiential subjects, I mean, I not merely encounter them as subjects with perspectives of their own on the world, I frequently also experience them as subjects with perspectives on their own on me. I mean, and so in order to spell out what is happening here, it's very important to recognize that it's not just that, I have a perspective on the world and the other has a perspective on the world, and we consequently have a shared perspective on the world. No, it's also the case that I have a perspective on the other and that the other has a perspective on me. And the fact that we have perspective on each other is precisely what also has to be factored in order to explain how those perspectives can then also concern a shared world. The question, though, that I want to raise is, well, how is all of that possible? How is it possible that we can engage with others, that we can have an experience of the world being shared by us? How is it that participants can know that they have obtained what is known as attention contact with each other? And it's at this point that I want to reintroduce the people that I kind of alluded to earlier on, namely those people who deny that we can have experiences of other people's experiences. That is, those people who would argue that subjective experiences are precisely only subjective and invisible to everybody else. Subjective experiences are strictly and exclusively private. So here's one quote. This is by Leslie in a seminal paper in the theory of mind debate. So this is an old paper by now. One of the most important powers of the human mind is to conceive of and think about itself and other minds. Because the mental states of others, and indeed of ourselves, are completely hidden from the senses, they can only ever be inferred. Now, Leslie is actually a fairly radical proponent of this view because he goes a step further. He doesn't just argue that it's the mental states of others that are invisible. He actually also claims that our own mental states are invisible to ourselves. They can't be seen, they can only be inferred. They are theoretical constructs. Other people more recently have argued, and they then primarily talk about the minds of others, claiming that the minds of others are hidden and that the mental states of others are to be, conceived of as inherently unobservable constructs or as inherently invisible. And it's partly because of this way of talking that there is then what we could call a problem of other minds. It's because the mental states of others are invisible that social cognition is such an enigma. Now, let's just for a second forget about those considerations and consider something that I believe is a very simple, everyday example. I throw a ball to you, you return the ball to me. What is happening in that very simple interaction? Well, I would say not only do I have an experience of us doing something together, I also have an experience of that ball being there for both of us. I mean, a super simple example. And I mean, presumably something all of us, I mean, are experiencing in modification. I would argue that we all experience modifications of that very simple example again and again in daily life. Now, had we in fact been opaque to each other, had we been invisible to each other, I think our ability to recognize the presence of another experiential perspective, as well as our very ability to experience that we are jointly experiencing something that is there for both of us, would be severely compromised. Or to put it differently, I mean, were we to assume that consciousness is at best a private phenomenon that is invisible to others, were we to assume that subjective experiences are, and that was the starting point of my entire discussion, are internal private objects, I don't think it would make much sense to speak of joint attention and shared experiences. I mean, if one were to speak of such phenomenon, it would only be in a very, very metaphorical sense. But I just think that we have everyday examples that speak against that kind of framing. So I think that we, in order to, give justice to, in order to do justice to, in order to explain everyday occurring phenomena, we have to stay away from an account that claims that we are completely opaque to each other. But we also have to stay away from an account that claims that we are completely transparent to each other and that everything is open to view. Now, why do we have to stay away from that kind of account? Well, because we have to respect the fact that the other's experiential presence is of a very particular kind. And that is, of course, what then brings us back to Marbach's reading of Husserl and to the question of egocentricity. I mean, I think Husserl would argue that it's possible to experience the other's mind immediately and non-inferentially. And I think his label for that kind of experience was empathy. But while saying that, he also kept insisting that there by necessity is a difference between how I experience the other's experience and how that experience is lived through by the other. There is an asymmetry here, there is a difference there. And my way of spelling that out is in the following way. We have to recognize that experiences are first personal and that experiences have first personal givenness. But we have to concede, or we have to allow for more than that, because if we were merely saying that experiences are first personal and that that is the givenness of experiences, I think we would run into versions of the difficulties I've just been spelling out. We have to concede, concede is really the right term, sorry, it's the wrong term. We have to realize, we have to recognize that experiences can have other forms of givenness than first personal givenness. They can also be accessed by others second personally and third personally. And of course, one of the famous claims by Husserl was that the fact that our access to the experiential states of others is not first personal, the fact that we cannot partake in the first personal acquaintance that other people have with their own mind, that this is not an imperfection, this is not a shortcoming, this is exactly how it should be. Because it's only because of that difference, it's only because of that asymmetry that we can claim that the minds we experience are precisely other minds and not our own minds. So again, coming back to the problem I also alluded to when discussing the case with the empathic grasp of the distressed child. I mean, when I have an empathic grasp of the distressed child, there are two different experiences present. And not only are there two different experiences present, but these are also experiences belonging to two different subjects. And if we are to talk about an encounter with other minds, we need, of course, to maintain that difference. So another way of putting it is basically to say that, were we per impossible, and that is impossible, to have had, were we to have first personal access to the minds of others, were we to have the same kind of access to the minds of others as we have to our own mind, that would destroy the very difference between us. It will eliminate the difference between us, and it would then no longer make sense to speak of a plurality of experiential perspectives. But if we are to have objectivity, that won't do, because the whole point of the initial analysis of objectivity was precisely to insist that there is a difference, a very, very significant difference between me having a serious of consecutive experiences of one and the same object, and me having an experience of somebody else also having an experience of the same object. I mean, me having the latter kind of experience provides the object with a very different validity and sense than me simply having consecutive experiences of one and the same object. But in order for that difference to make sense, the way that I experience the other experiencer's experience of the object obviously have to be different from the way I experience my own experience of the same object. And that requires precisely, that requires that experiences can be given in more than just a first personal way. So to basically wrap up, I mean, I think joint attention can be classified as and characterized as a very fundamental meeting of minds. It is something that establishes a bridge between us. It allows us to share a perspective, but a bridge is precisely something that connects what remains distinct. It's not something that eradicates that very distinction. And had it eradicated that very distinction, well, the very phenomenon would then have been destroyed. Because it's precisely because of our experiential difference, it's precisely because of our distinct experiential perspectives that the intersubjective accessibility of an object can testify to its objective validity, even if that might initially just be a limited form of objectivity and something that should be distinguished from objectivity in the strong sense, namely understood as that which is valid for all rational subjects. So to conclude, I mean, what I basically been arguing throughout this whole talk is that we should welcome clearly that people outside of phenomenology have started to take subjective experiences seriously again. But one of the problems that I think characterizes some of these more recent attempts at doing phenomenology in scare quote is that subjective experiences are analyzed in isolation. I would want to argue that if we are to understand the proper significance of subjective experiences, we should not investigate them in isolation. No, what we should precisely be looking at is the intertwinement and relation between the subjective, the intersubjective, and the objective. And basically, my main argument in this paper has been that insofar as the notion of objectivity, insofar as that is understood as that which is valid for and accessible to all. I mean, if that's what objectivity is understood as, well, then it obviously involves an appeal to intersubjectivity. And you can only have intersubjectivity as an experiential phenomenon if you are operating with a conception of phenomenal consciousness that on the one hand does justice to first personal subjectivity and to reflexivity and pre-reflective self-consciousness, but at the same time you also have to allow for givenness of consciousness, I mean, that warrants us talking of other experience of Fremderfahrung. I mean, we need both of those aspects, otherwise the whole theoretical construction will collapse. So to kind of wrap up my main kind of message here is that subjective experiences are not private objects. Subjective experiences are precisely what in the first instance allows us to encounter an objective world. And part of the reason why they can do that is precisely because they are not private. they are also accessible to others. So when talking about phenomenology, it's clearly not adequate, as unfortunately is so frequent in contemporary discussions in analytic philosophy and cognitive science. It's clearly not adequate simply to understand phenomenology as a careful description of the world's likeness of subjective experiences. I mean, phenomenology is a very rich philosophical tradition that has thought long and very deep about the significance of consciousness. And again, I mean, as hopefully should have become clear through this talk, it's not focused on the study of the qualitative field of experience. It's not focused on an exploration of qualia. And it's definitely not, and that was the argument and criticism of Dennett, it's clearly not committed to some kind of mythological solipsism or to a method that involves a dubious, and I quote, introspectionist bit of mental gymnastics. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dan, for this very interesting talk. So now we have time for Q&A, some questions here or maybe in Zoom. Okay, we have a question here from Professor Thiel Groman.
Yeah, thank you very much for this talk, Dan Zahavi. We couldn't meet here, so hello from far away.
You hear well? Do you hear him well?
Sorry,
can you hear Thiel talking?
Well, initially, but then he suddenly stopped, but perhaps that was on purpose.
Yeah, I stopped talking.
Yeah, okay,
you hear me, no?
Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, so thank you for your talk. I was asking myself while listening to you, you presented the phenomenological point of view as, well, saying that objectivity is assured once we have a dyad of subjects. So a twofoldness. There are other point of views, maybe in the Hegelian tradition or the Freudian or the Freudo-Hegelian tradition, who always claims that we need a triad. We need the institution of a law that, well, institutes justice or an external measure that mediates between the dyad. So would you say that the phenomenological point of view is against that and saying, well, we can assure objectivity already within the dyad? Or
Yeah, well, I mean, so basically, what I was trying to argue for was, well, no, let me rephrase. I mean, clearly, I did not have sufficient time to elaborate on, especially Husserl's discussion of the constitution of objectivity. What I briefly alluded to was the fact that he doesn't just talk about one level of objectivity. He actually talks of a whole series of different levels. What I think he would insist upon is that even in the very minimal case of a dyad, there is something happening in the constitution of sense and validity that is not possible for a singular subject. So there's something very important happening already in the dyad. But of course, this is not the end of the process. I mean, again, there are many different layers beyond that. And if you, I mean, I can perhaps elaborate a little bit, because in my recent book, Being We, I mean, I'm actually discussing the triad. I have a specific discussion of the triad. I think one interesting point in Husserl is that Husserl does discuss what in the literature is called triadic joint attention. So sometimes in the literature there's a discussion or there's a distinction between dyadic joint attention and triadic joint attention. Dyadic joint attention is basically face-to-face encounter. Triadic joint attention is when we jointly attend to an external object. What you don't find in Husserl, at least I've never come across it, is a specific discussion, not of the triad understood as two subjects and an object, but the triad understood as three subjects. And I actually think that the introduction of a third subject is also doing something quite important, bringing us beyond merely the dyad. I mean, there's this famous saying from by Simmel, where Simmel says that the transition from the dyad to the triad is really a qualitative change. It's not just a quantitative increase. I would very much agree with that. I think, again, I mean, without having to, I mean, I can't kind of go too much into it, but I think I would just say the following: in Husserl, you can't. I don't find any discussion of the triad in Husserl. I think there are other phenomenologists who clearly does attribute a very clear constitutive significance to the triad understood as three subjects. I mean, the most famous one is, of course, Sartre, but you also find similar discussions in, for instance, Berger and Luckmann. So there are, I mean, so if your question is, what are the resources in phenomenology, and are there any phenomenologists who have at all attended to, the constitutive role of triads, my answer would be yes. And then perhaps just one final critical point. I mean, if the critical question would be, or if the insistence from, so to speak, non-phenomenological origin would be that the dyad doesn't really do anything, or it can't constitute objectivity in any sense whatsoever. We need institution, we need law, etc. I would then say that that's a view that I do not share, and I don't think most phenomenologists would share it. I mean, so again, it's not on off. It's not an attempt to dismiss that when you have institutions and when you have also three subjects, that adds in complication to the very minimalist account of objectivity that we get at simply by looking at the dyad. But I think most phenomenologists would insist that already the dyad actually does something that moves us beyond the kind of sense constitution that is possible for a single subject.
Okay. Luis? Okay, we have another question from Luis Rabanake.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Dan, for your presentation. It was very enlightening and very interesting too, with so many points. But there is a lot of questions I would like to ask, but by now only one small question. Now, you spoke about those several layers, Schichten of constitution, and that allowed me to remember and to ask you, what would be the role of language in all these dyadic and triadic and so on relationships? No, if I understood well, you talked about empathy. And of course, it may be the first approach to the other, but also the linguistic approach, no, in the sense maybe of Rede, not Sprache, as Heidegger puts it. Also the living language, because I think it's also intertwined, has a very important role in this primal constitution of the intersubjective objective world, and for objectivities above all. So
yeah. Sorry, thank you so much. I mean, Yeah, so again, I mean, it depends a little bit on how to understand the question. I mean, am I supposed to answer as Sahavi, or am I supposed to answer as a Husserl scholar? So what would Husserl say to the question? But I mean, I think that perhaps to start with the latter, I mean, what would Husserl say? Well, I think Husserl clearly acknowledges, yeah, well, obviously, I mean, that the introduction of language expands the scope of the account that I have been presenting, the basic building blocks of. And I mean, one I think very interesting remark by Husserl is that he says that that in and through language, I mean, one thing is, the way in which my experience of the world is influenced by how I experience other subjects that are co-present with me experiencing that very world. So that's, of course, all, so to speak, limited to my, uh, Umwelt. I mean, to use Schütz's phrase, it's my kind of immediate surrounding world. I mean, people turn up within that immediate surrounding world, and how they react and respond to the things I consider and look at will influence how I'm viewing it, etc., etc. But then what Husserl then says is that, by way of language, I will also start to be influenced not by the people that I am merely, and I will start to be influenced also by people who are absent, people that those I meet have met in turn. I mean, so it's more like not an immediate, but a more mediated form of if you will, intersubjective influence. So this is one of the things that language can do. I mean, that language allows us to make present what is absent, and thereby also allows us to constitute additional levels of objectivity. And I mean, now I'm just talking about, if you will, a horizontal expansion in the present. But of course, what language also allows us to do is, of course, to be influenced by a kind of more vertical horizon, a horizon that goes back temporally. So of course, there's so many ways in which our, constitution of objectivity is linguistically mediated. I mean, in no way would I dispute that. But what I would dispute, and I think that is perhaps where the potential disagreement will arise. I mean, I don't think between the two of us, but between, alternative accounts of the constitution of objectivity. Because I mean, I mentioned Davidson and Habermas, and of course, I mean, they would both agree that the proper way to understand objectivity is not to view it simply as something that is out there, independent of the community. I mean, they very much want to bring in the community. They very much want to bring in the intersection of perspectives. But for both Habermas and Davidson, this is primarily a linguistic, mediated process. So for them, language is, so to speak, the fundamental layer. And I think this is where, I mean, clearly a Husserlian account would differ, because what I think Husserl would insist upon is that this whole constitution of objectivity, again, it presupposes as its foundation a specific conception of first personal subjectivity and a specific conception of other experience. And it's because consciousness is constituted in this manner that it also allows then for subsequent layers of linguistic, structuring to be possible. So I think Husserl would say, I think, and I think that would be my view as well, it's precisely by taking seriously these experiential embodied layers that we can then, make comprehensible how this linguistic expansion is to happen. Whereas if you start out with the linguistic model and basically do not attend to or show no interest in phenomenal consciousness, intentional subjectivity, embodied, expressivity, then I think you just lose, the possibility of coming up with a convincing account. So I mean, just to kind of wrap up, I mean, of course, I agree that I mean, if one is to account for the constitution of objectivity in the full sense, of course we need language. But my main point was that, contrary to Davidson and Habermas, that it can't all be a question of language, because that will be like floating in air. I mean, we need experience and embodiment as well.
Thank you, Dan. We have another question. Yeah,
Hello. Hello, Professor. I have a question with a topic that I think is not the central one from your work, but you worked in a paper called Internalismus, Externalismus, and Transcendental Idealismus, 2008, I think. And I was thinking from the point of the problem of the phenomenological immanence and the critique of Searle in the article or paper, mejor, the phenomenological illusion. I was thinking when we have experience with other, we experience in a pre-reflexive kind of way, and external things to the phenomenological experience come in our way, how can we, as a we, modify our orientation in a pre-reflexive or in a thematic way to not only transform our singular structure of our experience, but that we have in common, how to transform what we have in common when external things happens to us, attending to this kind of objection from the point of view of self, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I just have to be sure that I fully understood. I mean, I guess I just need to have one question of clarification. I mean, when you talk about external things, I mean, it could be understood in different ways. I mean, do you merely mean external in the sense of not being contained inside my mind? So, for instance, I mean, this glass that I'm holding here, that's external. I mean, is it those kinds of
things that are not contemplated in our phenomenological experience?
Yeah,
things
but
that happens, occurs.
Yeah, but I think that's where, there might be some misunderstanding, because I mean, how to put this? I mean, I think it would be a huge misunderstanding of what phenomenology amounts to if the idea was that the only thing that phenomenologists are allowed to speak about is what is immanent to their consciousness. I mean, I think this is just a complete misunderstanding, because it would not allow phenomenologists to take intentionality seriously. I mean, so this object, I think, can be described phenomenologically. It's not part of my experience. It transcends my experience, but it's still given to me. And I think I can perfectly well describe that phenomenologically. So I think, I mean, there might be different notions of what we mean by phenomenology, and perhaps also what we mean by immanence. And I think that could potentially be, a real. I mean, people could really speak at cross purposes there, because I think from I mean, what I take to be a phenomenological attitude, your question about how is it possible for us to influence and modify our experiences, not just my experience, but our experiences of the world. I mean, I don't think that I see no reason why that should be a problem that should be particularly difficult for a phenomenologist, precisely because of the way in which we understand what experience is. I mean, so for instance, I might, I don't know, what can I mean, for instance, I might look at this, sorry, it's always a little bit difficult to come up with convincing.
I understand what you say, and I understand what you're trying to say to me. I know, and I see it as well as you do, but it's common to have this debate with analytic like Searle or Dennett that put it that there's some things that occurs outside our experience, and in a certain way we kind to understand externalisms from a very points of view. Externalisms, for example, like put it Crowell or Christina Lafon, who thinks that external semantics that in some way can affect our experience, and we can reorder, restructure our the basis of our alertness, the basis of our experience. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, okay, but I think it's just if you refer to Stephen Crowell, I mean, I would in many ways align with his view, because one of the points he makes is to point out that the notion of immanence can have two different meanings. I mean, and that it does not coincide. Yeah, and it's a little bit it's a little bit like a complicated discussion. But I think what Steve points out is that immanence is not just a question of what is reell enthalten, what is concretely contained in my mind, and to claim that phenomenologists are only allowed to discuss what is actually contained inside their experiences is a misunderstanding. Sometimes Husserl talks about, the phenomenological reduction as somehow involving a focus on what is phenomenologically immanent. And what Steve then points out is that Husserl also operates with a different notion of immanence, where immanence refers to what is phenomenologically given intuitively. And that could even pertain to something like, an object which is clearly transcendent to me, but insofar as it is intuitively given, it can to some extent be said to be immanent because it has a certain evidence. So I don't really know. I mean, so on the one hand, I think when Stephen Crowell talks about externalism, I mean, that's a very different kind of externalism than when Dennett, for instance, would refer to, subpersonal mechanisms that in various ways are influencing our experiential lives. So I just think we need just to be clear about how we are using the concept. Otherwise, it will be a complete mess. I mean, again, to perhaps try to quickly wrap up the discussion. I mean, what I wrote in the article you were referring to, I was basically making the case that the internalism-externalism debate, which seems to be premised on a divide between what is inside consciousness and what is outside of consciousness, is to some extent very problematic, because it buys into a specific mind-world dichotomy that I actually think phenomenology is trying to overcome. And that's why I'm arguing that, that to some extent I think it's misleading both to classify phenomenology as a form of internalism, but also to classify it as a form of externalism, because that very inner-outer division is precisely something that the phenomenologists are trying to kind of get rid of. So I mean, I just think, speaking of Dennett and Searle and Stephen Crowell and Christine Lafont, I mean, there are just too many actors here, and they are coming from very different perspective. So it's kind of hard for me to kind of, provide you with an answer that somehow relates and adequately responds to whatever might be said from these very different corners. Yes, I'm sorry.
No problem, no problem. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question. Hi, Professor Dan. I have a question that came to me while you were talking. My question is, if I didn't understand wrong, you said that our to possibilitate the intersubjective experience, we have to start from an first ecological experience, and I wanted to know how is that possible for a kid to have an experience of reality and an objective experience. If you think that kids already had an ecological experience, like an ego who can join or be attached to every experience. Sorry, if you think that kids already had an ego experience of themselves, or how other way will be possible for them to get to be in a objective world. And also I wanted to know, when you said that we have experience of the other that is not an inference nor an immediate intuition, what status will have that experience of the other? Thank you.
Okay, I mean, these are huge questions to some extent, but I think, perhaps let me start with the latter. So what I was trying to do was to carve out. I was trying to avoid two extremes when it comes to understanding other experiences or intersubjective relations. The one extreme is to say that I have the same kind of access to the other's experience as I have to my own. I basically have a first personal access to the other's experience. I was trying to avoid that, and I was trying to avoid the reverse extreme, which is to say I have no experience of the other's experience whatsoever. My only access to whatever might be happening psychologically in the other is inferential. I think both of those options are very unhelpful and I think both of those options would prevent us from understanding very widespread ordinary phenomena like me and you attending to something together. Because if my access to others were merely inferential, well, I think that would basically mean that there would be we couldn't have mutual awareness. We couldn't jointly be aware that we are now attending to something together. I could have an experience of myself attending together, and then I could have, in a very kind of empty theoretical way, the assumption or the hypothesis that somebody else might perhaps be doing that as well. But I think that, of course, it's a little bit difficult for me to be doing this with you when I'm in Copenhagen. But had I been in the same room with you, there could have been, eye contact between us, and we could be attending to objects together. And I would say, well, that's very different from me merely having a hypothesis that you might currently be attending to something. So I think that, again, the phenomenon I'm trying to understand is really something like joint attention. I'm saying, were our access to others merely inferential? We couldn't account for it. Had I the same kind of access to your mind as I have to my own? it would also destroy the phenomenon of joint attention, because it would not be a plurality of perspectives that are brought together. It would just be one bigger perspective, and that destroys the very phenomenon that we are trying to explore. And then you might ask, well, what is there then in between these two extremes? And I would say, well, that's exactly the kind of empathic encounter with others that the phenomenologists are typically talking about. It qualifies as a form of experience, but it's an other experience. It's not an expanded self-experience, so to speak. Then there's the question about, how do infants and young children understand the world? I mean, and I think there are kind of two questions. There are basically two sub-questions in that part of the question. The first sub-question has to do with the question of whether the consciousness of infants are ecological. I mean, do infants already have first personal experiences or not? My reply to that would be an unequivocal yes. Because on the way I understand first personal experience, I think it's a built-in feature of consciousness per se. So you can't have consciousness without having it. And were we again per impossibile to suggest that infants were having experiences that were not first personally, then one of the questions I would raise would be, well, how are they going to move from that strange situation to one of actually having acquired first personal subjectivity? And I have no clue. I mean, I have no idea how that transition was supposed to have happened. So I would argue that infants are first personal subjects in the very minimal sense in which I'm using the term from the outset. But then finally to the slightly more challenging question, because I think this is partly an empirical question. I mean, when do children start to have an experience of the world as objective? And I mean, I'm not sure that I'm necessarily, as a philosopher, the right person to ask about that. I mean, what I would simply argue is that if they are to have an experience of the world as objective in the way I have been talking about it, well, it will require social interaction. It will require a gradual, realization of the fact that there are other perspectives, and a growing recognition of the fact, that others have experiences that are different from their own. And exactly when that happens, I mean, developmental psychologists are occasionally, disagreeing about that. But perhaps one thing, just for curiosity, or I mean, one detail that I kind of remember is that think about lying. I mean, when do children start doing that? When do they start to pretend? And I mean, some psychologists would say, well, the whole issue of lying actually only comes up at a developmental stage after the infants have realized that there is a certain privacy to their own mind. I mean, not the privacy in the strong sense that I have been criticizing, but a privacy in the sense of not being completely transparent. I mean, and I think that is something that the infant clearly does not already know from the outset. I mean, the fact that it has to, communicate its needs to its mother, and that the mother doesn't immediately pick it up is a growing recognition. And likewise, I mean, the moment the infant realizes that, well, it can actually pretend, it can say things that aren't true, and the mother will not immediately realize this because the mother do not have, its own mind is not transparent to the mother. I mean, these are all developmental stages that developmental psychologists have been, investigating. And so again, when exactly in the development the child will start to have an understanding of reality as being objective in the same way as we adults do. I mean, I think, I don't have a very precise answer, but it is probably something that, where you have to, it will take a while. Let me put it like that. So I don't think it's something that is available from birth onwards.
Okay, thank you. I would say if there's an urgent question, we can take just one 5-minute question. If not, maybe we can wrap up. See? ¿Cómo?
No hay ningún. No.
I know that you know. I've read in the BBC yesterday that there's a new study that shows that children visit from 10 months old. So that's an answer I read in the in the journal yesterday. I'm just waiting for to see. So see done. Last question.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Zahavi, for your presentation. My question is some kind of off topic because you mentioned that the problem or the reason behind Husserl's change of mind between the two editions of logical investigation lays on this problem of alterity, according to Marbach. And I think that I always think that the reason behind this modification in Husserl's perspective on ego resides on Husserl's theory of time and the problem that he tried to resolve with the notion of absolute consciousness, because this is the way to understand how we are aware of ourselves in the present. So it's not a question, maybe it's
okay. Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I guess so. I mean, there was, of course, in the build-up of the argument, I mean, there was a particular reason why I was interested in bringing in this issue of intersubjectivity as a possible motivation. But of course, one might wonder, could there have been other motivations as well? I mean, I guess, considering that doesn't have to entail that Marbach was wrong, that the issue of intersubjectivity could not also have played a role. But one can, of course, wonder whether there might be other explanations. And I mean, more historical explanations could have to do with also, for instance, Husserl's discussion with Nartorp. I mean, he spent time with the neo-Kantians between first edition and the second edition. Surely he was influenced by those discussions as well. So I mean, I think that there's certainly more to be said than what I was talking about. But I guess I have one. I mean, I'm just a little bit wondering about the specific argument you wanted to point to, because I think we need to distinguish two different questions here. I mean, yeah, well, even though they are, of course, intertwined. I mean, on the one hand, I would agree with you. I mean, that the whole discussion of, we could call it reflexivity or self-presentation or self-consciousness, I mean, clearly a very important factor in motivating Husserl to think about those specific questions was, of course, his analysis of inner time consciousness. And I mean, I have made the case in previous writings that the most elaborate discussion of self-consciousness that we find in Husserl is precisely to be found in his lectures on inner time consciousness. So to that extent, I mean, that might be in favor of your view. The only reason why I hesitated a little bit is because there are, of course, also these other famous passages of Husserl where he talks about, he talks about the pre-ecological level. I mean, he talks about how a deeper and deeper analysis of time consciousness also brings us to a level I mean, that is not, ecological in the strong sense of the term. So there are kind of further, I mean, so there, I guess all I want to say is that there are some further complications here about what exactly do we mean by ego, and should we distinguish different types of egos? And I mean, Husserl is also kind of engaging with all those questions when starting to dig into the problem of inner time consciousness. Yeah, I mean, so it's just that self-consciousness and time consciousness, I think that's very clearly linked. The question of the ego, I think, is a little bit more complicated because of, again, Husserl's occasional discussion of the passivity of temporalization, etc., etc. But I think one way to just understand your point is to say, is for me also to accept that there's clearly more to say about Husserl's transition from the non-ecological to the ecological account than merely pointing to the problem of intersubjectivity. There were clearly other factors involved as well. I mean, I perfectly accept that point.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. This was very motivating, very interesting, and we thank you for taking the time to dedicate the time to present your paper in these circumstances. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Thanks for coming. Thanks for all your questions. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And now we will have a break, a coffee break por, vamos a tener, ¿de cuánto? 15 minutos. 15 minutos.